We are live.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this webinar. We're going to be discussing today telework essentials to secure the hybrid workplace. We've known a lot of terms right now as we look at the remote workplace, what's happening from the pandemic, and more importantly, what we're looking at from a workplace perspective into the future. So certainly we saw the beginning, a change, and this discussion will focus on where we're going, and I'll get to that in a moment. But before we start, I want to introduce the panelists. It's a great pleasure to be joined by James Stanley from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and Phil Reitinger, the President and CEO of the Global Cyber Alliance. I'm Kirsten Todd. I'm the Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute. And we're just going to get right into it. This is going to be a discussion. I encourage everyone to put questions into the Q&A chat down at the bottom of the screen, and we will be answering those as we go along, but we'll also have time at the end of the session. We're breaking for 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, and look forward to your thoughts and any questions that you have for us along the way. To set the stage, as I mentioned, certainly we all know that starting on March 13th, when things began to shut down, we saw an immediate turn to work from a remote environment. So all employees were working from home. And as we've transitioned back, what we're learning from large companies, but small as well, is that this remote workplace is going to be more permanent, but even more so, this hybrid workplace where some employees are going to be working from home, some are going to be working from physical office space, and some are going to be toggling between the two. And so while we adjusted the security precautions and the security policies for the all remote workforce, there's certainly a different set of challenges that come from this hybrid workplace. And we're going to get into some of those today and hopefully offer some solutions as well. And again, I'm very pleased to be joined by James and Phil, who have been working a lot on this and the collaboration among all these organizations to really help small businesses and workplaces in this new environment. So James, I'm going to start with you. CISA recently launched the Cyber Telework Essentials Toolkit. And can you just talk to us a little bit about what the toolkit provides and the objective, what you sought out to achieve with this document?
Yeah, absolutely. So this toolkit was created after our telework working group within CISA realized this would be more of a permanent adjustment and something that the community needed to act on. So we identified 3 different groups within organizations that would need sort of different or had different information and priorities. So we touched on executive leaders of an organization, IT administrators, and of course the end users. And then we provided as much actionable information for these groups as possible. So I think the key word for us when we were looking into this was actionable. So each section provides the different groups with prioritized topics to focus on, and then links to the best possible resources provided by various organizations. I just want to mention it was absolutely invaluable to be able to partner with your groups, GCA and CRI, to kind of lean on the resources that you guys had already available for public consumption.
Thanks, James. And I definitely want to go back to a little bit more about what's in the toolkit. But before I do that, I'm interested from both of your perspectives. I know Phil, GCA has worked a lot through the pandemic, and we've been, CRI has been so pleased to work with you as well as with CISA, as we've all been trying to create content and tools in figuring out how to secure the workplace. And we've definitely identified more and more challenges and issues over the course of these 8 months. But I'll start with you, Phil. I mean, what are you seeing as the primary cyber challenges of this more permanent telework hybrid environment?
So, what I'd say, Kirsten, is that this is not something that's totally new, right? We've always had something of a hybrid workforce, and there's been a long-term trend already to deperimeterize networks. People would come in from different places. What we found with the pandemic environment is it really, it put all of that on steroids. It super accelerated all of that. So you needed to be able to move much faster to a full-on deperimeterized, cloud-focused environment. Fortunately, you need to still basically do the same things. You need to reprioritize a little and devote resources, but hygiene was super important before. You had to get the basics right. And hygiene is even more important now. The challenge, I think, is doubling down on those things that are of even more importance in a distributed and a hybrid environment, and thinking about what are the additional things that come in. So I'll highlight two for right now. One that's very clear is you really need to accelerate your focus on multi-factor authentication in a distributed work environment, because everything is at a distance. And if you were depending on physical controls before, so that only certain internal corporate devices could get access to certain resources, and part of the security protocol for those was you had to use your ID to scan in. Well, that's not good anymore, right? So and you're all acting at a distance. So there's no going down the hall to talk to somebody and say, did you really send this email or not? That makes the strongest form of authentication very, very important. The other thing I'd say is communication. This is not on the IT side, but communication becomes even more critical. This is true from a leadership perspective. It's true from a person-to-person perspective. There's so much that you lose that isn't even IT focused when you move into this environment. And you've got to make that up somehow. And so things like video conferences, some of the human pieces of cybersecurity, I think become just as or more important.
So I think, Phil, it's a really interesting point, because I think, one of the reasons why GCA and CRI do so much work together is the complementary nature of what you provide from a technical perspective and our focus on human behavior. And James, with you at CISA, kind of bringing all of this and aggregating these different pieces together, that human behavior piece on communications is one of these, it's the qualitative element that, we know is important, but when we're in this remote environment, you really have to be deliberate. And it creates all these issues. One of the things we talk about at CRI is the creation of habits, particularly in this environment around security. And that comes from the communication and the reminder of what you need to be focusing on and how to do that. I do want to get to some of the execution of MFA, Phil, in a second. But James, as you wrote this particular guide, but I know you've worked on a lot of content this year, what are you seeing as the primary challenges, and what have you seen of this telework and hybrid environment, evolved hybrid environment?
I think some of the challenges, well, Phil definitely touched on communication, and that's one that I think has always been a challenge. And again, this isn't necessarily new. It's just more highlighted now than ever. So I think communication from the IT administrators to the end users has never been great. And I think we're really seeing that now, where the end users need to be aware that they are almost a single point of failure. So they need to be more vigilant than ever. There's only so much that an IT administrator can do, but I also think just as a community, this is something we've been harping on at CISA for several years now, is just kind of the sharing is caring mantra, that we need to share with each other what we're seeing going wrong, how we're fixing it, how we're addressing it. And so hopefully that's something that we're doing here today. I know some private industry organizations as well as federal organizations have been working with our agency with a lot more information, a lot more sharing than we've seen before. So I think people are starting to realize that communication is a big, important step, and we're starting to make that change.
That's great. And as we look at the communication piece, just to go a little bit deeper on this, are there tools? So you talk about an IT department, James, and one of the things that Phil and I have talked about from the small business side, and I know you guys have as well at CISA, is what happens when you don't have an IT department, right? What happens for these organizations that don't have the resources? And you're obviously communicating to your employees. To both of you, are there other opportunities that you would recommend from sharing? I mean, you talked a little bit about sharing what you're seeing across businesses. Are there resources, perhaps, and maybe it's through CISA, James, that you would recommend for those businesses and how to learn more about what businesses are seeing from a threat perspective, and also where the solutions are?
Yeah, so first of all, I think I would highly encourage everyone to visit CISA's Telework page. So it's simply CISA.gov/telework. We have a dedicated group that I mentioned earlier inside the agency. The whole mission is to identify various challenges to this new environment, and either we would create new reference material or pull from outside organizations who have already addressed the topics. So this website has a large library of resources, ranging from specific guidance to federal agencies all the way to video conferencing tips, and tips and help for people at home trying to secure their networks so their kids can attend online school. So this is really what we're trying to build out as an all-encompassing resource, from parents at home helping their kids go to school all the way over to federal organizations and large businesses protecting their environment.
Thanks, James. And I know, Phil, GCA has toolkits that are looking at these different pieces. Can you just take some time to walk through the resources that you offer and what you're focusing on?
Absolutely. So for the broader piece, which is both for work from home and not work from home, as you might recall, I said at the start, you need to do hygiene, right? And hygiene is hygiene, whether you're in the corporate environment or you're at home. So we've built, with partners, including both CISA and the Cyber Readiness Institute, a set of free tools that anyone can use, any small business can use, to go through and implement basic cyber hygiene. In our view, there's a lot of really good guidance out there already for small businesses. The challenge is it is very, very difficult to implement because, perhaps the guidance is, use multi-factor authentication. And then the next question is, well, how do I do that? Right. And for a lot of small businesses, just trying to figure out how you do that is too big a bridge to consider going down. They're trying to survive in a really awful economic time. And so what we did is we've got a curated set of free resources that are mapped to the basic things you need to do. So, for example, one of the things that you need to do is to patch your systems. So in that case, we have a toolbox on updating your systems, and it has both the information on why, right? So there's a basic video and a very simple to understand, less than 2-minute video on what the threats are and why you want to use strong authentication, and then the tools you can use to go through that's strong authentication, updating your systems. And the tools you can use to turn on auto updating, for example, in a Microsoft, an Apple, or an Android platform. So it's sort of a one-stop shop with a bunch of additional resources that can give you pretty much everything you need, right? It's sort of the just add water attempt to approach basic cybersecurity, from the awareness piece through the implementation piece. And we include, as I said, a lot of partner resources. So we have policies. If a small business, how do you have a policy on these sorts of things? They don't know how to write that. And, for the most part, we don't write those things either. We point to other resources like for USB policy and a user awareness training. It points to the resources from the Cyber Readiness Institute, which are also free. And we've just recently brought on a set of additional policies from the New York Department of Financial Services that were written for small financial institutions, but can also be used by anyone. So there's a lot of resources there that one can bring together to tackle the broader set. I will say, though, there are things that you ought to do first, right? So this webinar is about cyber or remote work is here to stay, right? But maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you're in the, oh gosh, I need to do something, right? So it's not the continuance that you've actually got to move out and do something. For that, there are a few basic things I would do first. And we worked with a number of nonprofits, a total of 23, including, again, the Cyber Readiness Institute, to push forward some basic thoughts. That's the toolkit I mentioned before is at gcatoolkit.org/small business. This set of resources is at workfromhome, just all written together, .globalcyberalliance.org, is a set of basic practices for either individuals or companies to implement. And we focus on doing 3 really simple things to start. 2 I've mentioned: use strong authentication. Second, patch your systems. And the third, which is probably the highest ROI for anything, use a protective DNS service. And happy to go into details, but for this audience, I'll just say a protective DNS service is something that the National Security Agency of the United States has said can mitigate 92% of malware-based attacks. That's even better stat than we generated. But it'll take you 30 seconds on your home computers to do it, and maybe a couple of minutes if you try to do it on your business router. So it's definitely something everybody ought to do, and it's got a super high return on investment.
Phil, do you want to actually, I want to add on the behavioral side and some of the issues in a moment, but while you're on it, do you want to just walk through what that looks like, doing the DNS, the protective DNS? Is that something that?
Sure.
Accessibility.
I mean, here's what it looks like. Let's say you've got a Mac or you've got a Windows machine. You go into the network settings, and we've actually got videos on how to get into the network settings. It's a couple of clicks. And then if you go into sort of the advanced part of that, sorry, I can't change the way they do it, right? You can enter into what you use for your DNS service, right? And for those of you who don't know, DNS is the domain name system or the domain name service, and it's the phone book of the internet. So if you type in globalcyberalliance.org, the domain name system is that network service that says, oh, you want this actual address. So instead of giving you a street address, it gives you a network address, which is an IP address in the form of 131.25.45.67. 4 numbers separated by 3 dots. And what a domain name system, what a protective domain name system does is it embeds security in that process. So it's like you had a phone book that had lots of malicious numbers in it, along with all the good ones, and you went through with a black highlighter, like it was classified. We've done that before, right? I'm looking at Kirsten when I say that. And you dark out the classified stuff, or in this case, the malicious stuff. And so now you can't get the number for badguy.com. You can't go there. If you ask for it, you'll say that site doesn't exist. And so all you have to do is change that one set of 4 numbers in your IP settings. And again, literally will take you 30 seconds to 2 minutes to do it. And type in something like a free service that we help to build that does that is called Quad 9, which is 9.9.9.9. That's the number you have to type. You have to type 9 4 times in these 4 blocks with 3 dots between them. And it's super easy. You'll be, I like to tell people, don't try to do everything, do something, and you'll be so excited. You'll go on. You'll be far more secure if you type 9.9.9.9, or for that matter, 1.1.1.1, or some other service in there that does provides protective DNS, and then you'll be done. You can go away, and all of a sudden, if you type in a known malicious address into your browser, you may see that it comes back and says this. We didn't find that site. Sorry about that. And so you'll know you're more secure. I don't actually recommend going to a bad site because, maybe it's not known yet and maybe it's not blocked, but it's a really, really valuable thing to do. And you'll feel good about it. And you'll say, well, now I want to patch my systems. So that's what I'd recommend.
Thank you, Phil, because I think, so much of what we've talked about, and I know James with CISA, is that prescription. It's really getting to that place of what do you need to do. And we had talked about these different resources, and just to weigh in on the free resources that CISA offers, the free resources that GCA offers, and to build on what Phil was referencing with the Cyber Readiness Institute, kind of getting to that prescriptive piece. At the Cyber Readiness Institute, we focus on 4 issues grounded in human behavior. And as you know, we've created these guides over the course of the pandemic on ransomware, on securing remote workforce, but all of them are grounded in the 4 issues around USB use, which you mentioned, authentication, which is what a strong password looks like, phishing, and software updates. And just to the audience that's on the line today, going to that place of prescription, what we recommend as you're looking at this, how do you continue this security between the hybrid workforce, the workplace, and the remote workforce, is really focusing on 15-character passphrases, looking at software updates. Phil, you know this better than most given your history, but software updates are so critical, and it's inconvenient in that moment to just click on accept. But again, to the what we hear a lot from small businesses is, I don't always need to know the why, I need to know the how. But I do think from software updates, it's important to know the why, because there's so many great analogies. It is truly that someone has found a hole in your system, probably the person, the developer, and they're giving you a patch for it. And if you don't patch it, that hole just opens up and a malicious actor can go through it. And so other than being inconvenienced for the time that it takes to shut down your system, although even that is speeding up now, clicking on those updates immediately is so critical to securing your system, particularly as we're working from home computers and working from work computers. The other piece, as we've seen in this hybrid environment, is phishing. And so paying such close attention to phishing and false emails and what that looks like. Phil, you talked about USB use and working with the cloud. I think there are other ways there are ways to file share, and certainly right now looking at the cloud. But going back to the phishing piece, it goes to the multi-factor authentication. One of the things that we're seeing a lot with the Cyber Readiness Institute, and we really encourage, is multi-factor authentication. And I think, Phil, you said this great when you talked about we don't have the strongest form of authentication, which is often going to the office next door and saying, hey, I just got your email. Do you really want those funds transferred now, et cetera? So one of the things when you've got this hybrid workforce is picking up the phone and making personal communication another factor of authentication. We've seen enormous financial fraud over the course of the pandemic because people are getting emails saying transfer this amount of money. They're using the language of a CEO or the CFO or just the person in the office next door. And because we don't have that ability to verify, it becomes so important to pick up the phone and look at all those. So again, focusing on those basics. And I think, Phil, what you talked about with DNS, and I want to go to some of the challenges, but James, I want to make sure we've captured the recommendations as we talk about this prescription from this hybrid workforce. Is there anything else, James, that you would add for solutions and approaches to the challenges, the security challenges in this telework environment?
I'm not sure there's much I would add. I mean, you guys hit the nail on the head. The only thing maybe from an IT administrator perspective is an emphasis on network segmentation. So especially in the hybrid environment, if someone gets compromised, maybe just an end user employee using their cell phone, that actor is going to move laterally. And so segmentation can help avoid them moving across the entire network and accessing extremely important information. So that would be something that I would highlight just as far as an IT administrator role, is making sure that that is in place in your organization.
And so the network segmentation it raises, I think, the issue that we've all talked about a lot this in the pandemic, which is ransomware. We've certainly seen an uptick in ransomware across the board. There were those of us, I think, Phil, you and I had a few conversations about the concern that we had about potentially that impacting elections. I mean, you start looking at state and local governments and all these pieces. So in collaboration with CISA, we did a ransomware playbook that really talks about backups and the importance of backups. Now understanding the value of network segmentation, certainly when you're looking at ransomware, backing up on an alternative network, having those decisions, those qualitative decisions made ahead of time around would you pay a ransom, would you not? To both of you, and Phil, I'll start with you. What are some of the other approaches to prevent ransomware? But then if something happens, how to manage that when you're kind of already in it, that you would recommend to the users?
Well, ransomware, as you say, is sort of a growing challenge. It's a huge challenge already, and it's a growing challenge. And it's particularly prevalent because, at least in the press, the victims we all hear about now are small governments and school systems, or healthcare institutions, right? And we can say you have to consider whether or not you should pay ransom, but if you're a hospital and there are medical records that are encrypted and you can't do surgeries, I mean, there's no question, right? You're going to pay the ransom. It may be bad public policy, but it's not even a question when you're talking about protecting human life that you're going to pay it. And if governments want to change that, then governments need to consider how you change those incentives, because it is clearly the case that in a vast majority of environments, it makes corporate sense to pay a ransom, even if you don't get your data back, because it's worth it for the possible recovery of your data. In terms of preventing it, it's really the basics that you were talking about. Kirsten. The patching is super critical. Multi-factor authentication to prevent phishing is super critical. Doing all of the basics, and the emphasis on backups, grows even more. And ransomware is getting better and better. So, if your backup is stored on a USB drive connected to your computer, and it's online and connected to the computer that gets owned, I wouldn't count on the availability of that backup, right? You need to give some thought to having, everybody does offline backups and how you do that. There's some good news here too, though. And the good news is that's really a lot easier if you're not a really small business and you're doing these things in a cloud environment. Then a lot of those things are going to be taken care of, at least partially taken care of for you. And you just need to find the sort of the easy and right way to get that done. I did want to, I don't know if you want to cover it now or not, but I'd like to drill down at some point, Kirsten, a little bit more into the question of updating your systems that you talked about before, because it seems to me that that's uniquely different in a work from home environment. And what I mean by that is, as you were saying, patching your systems is really table stakes for cybersecurity. Sorry, I've got a dog barking if you can hear that. If you don't patch your systems, then there's not much I can do to help you. You can have all the fancy cybersecurity doodads and software and cybersecurity services and everything, and if you're not updating your Windows or Mac desktops, then it's pretty easy to own you, and it doesn't matter what else you've done. So you've got to do that. And so you've got to have the right policies, you've got to have the right technologies. But what's different in a work from home environment, and this goes back to what James was saying about network segmentation, right? The degree of network segmentation when somebody's dialing in from home, I'm showing my age, reaching in from home, right? Is it a BYOD device? Is somebody just, is somebody's computer busy and so they're using their kid's laptop? Or maybe they're using their work laptop, but you're on a network segment where, your kid's downloading illegal MP3s or MP4s all the time. And guess what? His or her laptop is just chock full of malware. Well, that lateral movement is not constricted to corporate environments. Lateral movement can take place in a home network. So, now your policy has got to be, if updating your systems is table stakes, now, and this goes to the human behavior part, you've really got to get your employees to secure all the devices on their home network. Is it absolutely essential that they do that? Probably not. Is it a good and very important? Absolutely. And your risk is controlled by what your employees do at home. So the corporate communications, the human behavior has got to really focus on hygiene in those remote environments.
And I want to turn to James a little bit on the ransomware, but I do want to get to this piece afterward, because it is, we take the policies that we've used, and Phil, you mentioned this at the outset, which is, hey, we've had a remote working for a long time. But as we look at this, we're being, the vulnerabilities of the remote work is being exposed and compromised in greater numbers. And so to what you just were talking about, how do we defend our networks in a different way? What does it look like to defend our networks and to be secure in this environment? What else do we have to be doing? Because I think the point that you're making around the BYOD and personal devices is critical. Before we go to that, James, I just wanted to ask you, because the point that Phil just raised, I think takes us into an important direction. But is there anything else on ransomware? Because I know CISA, I think it did another guide, maybe with a multi-state ISAC, or there have been other efforts, but anything else on ransomware that you want to share as far as policies and approaches?
So ransomware is it's a touchy topic. We've done a lot of publication on it here at CISA. What you previously mentioned, we did put out a ransomware guide with the MS ISAC, the multi-state ISAC, that went out about 2 months ago. It's basically a how-to guide on preventing ransomware and then responding to if you do have a ransomware outbreak at your organization. So it's a great guide. It's on CISA.gov. If you just type in ransomware, it'll get you there. And then we've also published recently when the healthcare sector was being targeted by ransomware. And that was more of a technical piece that we talked more about what the threat actors were using, how they were doing it. But at the end of the day, Phil brings up a great point that a lot of this stuff is pretty basic cyber hygiene. And so we're actually starting a ransomware campaign right now, just really putting out social media points and different things like that on the basic issues of, prioritize patch management. You absolutely need to, especially nowadays with so many people utilizing VPN devices, accessing, from home, and those VPN devices have been compromised and attackers are leveraging them quite a bit over the last several years. So really prioritizing patch management and doing different things like keeping your backups offline. We can't emphasize that enough, because most of the time when we see a ransomware outbreak, that's the first thing they say is, well, we had backups, but those backups were left online, so they were also encrypted. So yeah, I think a lot of this stuff isn't very complicated. It's just something that you need to prioritize as an organization. You need to make sure you're doing it day in and day out to avoid being one that is impacted, because ransomware can cripple an organization.
Yeah, James, I think those points are so critical, and the resources, we'll make sure all of the resources that Phil has mentioned, that you have mentioned, will be in the Q&A chat. Because one of the pieces, I think, ransomware can feel, even though we've talked about it so much, a little bit abstract if you're not in this IT world or in the cyber world on a day-to-day basis. And there was a trick bot that you guys are both familiar with, which was disrupted by Microsoft and Cyber Command ahead of the election. And in talking to the Microsoft Digital Crimes Unit, Phil's old stomping ground, what they talked about was that, when it comes to ransomware, it's still point of entry. And so for those that are on this webinar, what that means is it really comes back to authentication. It comes back to keeping your authentication strong. All of these issues, we've talked about them independently because they're each important and they require their own individual policies, but they do connect. And so when we're looking at ransomware, it's about software updates, the patching piece. It's about keeping access to your network strong, and that can be, through segmentation, but also just strong passphrases and passwords. And I think, we can sometimes get ahead of ourselves because we think ransomware, it's money and ransom. But at the end of the day, to both of what you've said, you break it down and it can start in a very simple place. And while that can be daunting because you can see how easy it is, you also know that there are basic things, to the points that were made at the very outset, basic things, basic hygiene issues that we've been talking about for years, that are really critical in making your system and your approach more resilient. I want to get back to what Phil started talking about, because I do think this is so critical. As we understand that this hybrid work environment is going to be more permanent, the question that I would ask each of you is, do we need to fundamentally rethink our approach to security? During the pandemic, we've seen an increase in cyber attacks, but we're using the same tools, right? We're using the same defensive tools, and we're seeing more entities become vulnerable. And it could just be education. It could just be training, awareness, and to the point that we talked about at the beginning, creating those policies that your employees, your organizations can execute. One of the things that we're fond of saying at CRI is, don't create, you can have the most rigid security policy that will ensure if everyone follows it, nothing's going to happen. But what happens when everyone just chooses the workarounds because they're inconvenient? So what are the practical policies that are needed? And so the point is there a rethinking that you think we need to do, or is it really about incorporating and creating these cultures of security where patching, phishing, file sharing, DNS, all of these things are much more a part of the organization than what we've seen? And obviously, I think education, training, awareness are a key piece of that. But do you have any thoughts? Do you think there's anything that we need to pivot toward, or is it about going deeper in what we already have? And Phil, I'll start with you.
I was going to kick it over to James for start.
Okay, either one. Rock, paper, scissors. James, you can go.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on. So I'm sure there's many people that are going to be disagreeing with me, or maybe, this is something that, everyone can have their own opinion. For my opinion, I would say all the resources are there to really have a strong cyber posture as an organization. I really think it's just about rethinking priorities, rethinking how you spend. I've been involved in organizations where They have millions and millions of dollars of security tools, but they're not implemented correctly.
Right.
I mean, it's really just, it's a point of using what you have and prioritizing what's important. So again, like with ransomware, we talk about simple points. Prioritize patch management. That doesn't cost more money. It maybe it's just prioritizing it, getting that through to everyone involved in the security teams that you need to prioritize that and make it a focus. So I don't think we need any real new cutting edge technology or new policies or procedures. It's just focusing on what we have and doing a better job of implementing. So that's where I think, a lot of this stuff is just with the environment changing, we're going to need to change quickly with what we prioritize, but nothing is necessarily new or cutting edge. And then, being more proactive from a security perspective than reactive, but it's an easy phrase to say, it's a difficult thing to implement.
But I think your prioritization point is really critical because it's what does it mean to prioritize, and how do you let your employees and your organization know that you've prioritized that and what you're doing to do so. And so whether that's a new policy that you distribute, whether it's to the point about communications, is it something that you talk about on a regular basis? One of the things that we've learned through CRI is that, when you onboard employees, that's the most appealing, attractive time to create your culture for your employees. So if you share and express those priorities with new employees, then they understand what their responsibilities are. And that's certainly a piece to this. Phil, what are your thoughts?
So I agree with James. I think it's all there. What I'd say I think is different, and I will say the pandemic didn't change my view. Perhaps it's my own internal prejudices and like to be correct, but it cemented my view. What's different about the pandemic is scale changed. Yep. We had scale increasing before, and scale has just gone even more exponential because now we've got these even more complex environments. So we're not just within a corporate perimeter. More and more people are outside. All these devices are connected. People are connecting to cloud services remotely. And some of these organizations, like James said, I mean, like they're some of the big banks whose information security budget exceed that of all but a couple of nations. And some of it are, John and Mary's dry cleaners, where it's a couple of people with computers, right? And they're maybe using Azure, or AWS, and G Suite or Office 365, right? And what do they know from cybersecurity? They're trying to keep their business running. So there's only one way to really approach that problem. And I like to say, I argued this in a Lawfare piece about a year or so ago. We've got to stop trying to teach people to fish, and we've got to give them food. People don't scale. Awareness doesn't scale. That doesn't mean that they're not critical. They absolutely are. People are a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. But if you're relying on people to be your defense, then you're always going to fail because people make mistakes. And so the approach that has to be different is we've got to really put much more effort into securing things out of the box, providing people with security that all they have to do is say, yes, don't disable, and give them automated security mechanisms that take that baseline security and keep it secure. And we've got a unique opportunity here, right? Because one of the trends that we've seen before that's accelerating is more and more businesses are moving to the cloud, right? So, you don't have this massive, 5 hard drive home computer with a local server. You're using Azure or AWS or IBM or Google or one of these other massive people who, guess what, are going to do a much better job patching systems than you are. If you just don't disable, the really interesting part of that is, we've been talking, and I've been talking for a long time about how we can all get more secure when we go to the cloud. But the empirical study, so Rapid7 has done one of these, right? Turns out when people go to the cloud, what they typically do is they take the crap they've got and they put that crap in the cloud, right? And so it's, it's no better. In fact, it's worse because it's more remotely accessible, right? So if we could manage that secure cloud transition, if people want to see a little bit more about that, New York City has done this recently. So they've moved very much to a cloud first architecture. And we actually did a webinar with Jeff Brown and Quiescence Phillips and Colin Ahern about how they did that. If we can move people, if I say, one thing CISA, for example, ought to really, really focus on in the next administration, and I hate people who say, you guys need to do this, right? But one thing is managing that secure cloud transition, making sure that services are available with security embedded, both configuration and monitoring from the start, and helping making those available at scale, because that's really the only way I see to approach this.
So I think the whole piece about, the transition to the cloud, when we were launching CRI and we're talking about small businesses, one of our members said, just tell every small business to go to the cloud. And the whole piece was backing up from that to say, well, you've got to educate them on what that looks like. And to your point, malware or, crap in one place is still going to be crap in another place, regardless of where it's going and what it's doing. But that file sharing in the cloud and how to secure it, I think becomes so critical. And your point about humans is obviously at the foundation of so much of the work that we've all been doing. I mean, we have this tension, and in work that I've done in the past, it's moving security away from the end user and educating the end user, and those don't have to be in conflict, right? You don't have to choose, they're not mutually exclusive. But it's also knowing where a human being can be valuable, where it can be a force multiplier for security, and where it can be a vulnerability. It's when you're inputting data, a machine should be doing that. A human being shouldn't be just inputting data because there's an accuracy issue. But when there's subjective judgment required and those different pieces. And I think, as we look at this, it is truly understanding what is the value and where human behavior plays a role. I mean, we can get off on a topic around ethics and artificial intelligence and human behavior and all of that. But I think when we're looking at this, to your point, it's, we're trying to move security away from the end user everywhere we can, but also knowing that we have to educate the end user in some of these pieces and what that looks like. And I think particularly in this environment, that balance to what you both have said becomes so critical. As we have talked, and Phil, you mentioned this earlier, and I know this is an interest of James as well, as certainly when you have individuals and employees working from home, they're going to be using personal devices. Bring your own device has been an issue far before the pandemic. And how do you secure? Do you have a device for work, a personal device? With new generations coming in, that becomes culturally more challenging. But what are the security challenges that you both are seeing that are presented by BYOD? How can they be addressed? And what can we, when we're talking to businesses that have this issue, and Phil, you talked about network segmentation across devices, but how can we address the security challenges that certainly have only increased in the pandemic with BYOD? And James, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so this one, I was kind of excited to include an example of something that we're seeing as we're on site as an agency going on site and helping with incident response. So BYOD, bring your own device. Definitely dangerous but necessary evil right now. So obviously it shouldn't be allowed if whenever possible, but a lot of the smaller organizations, it's not possible. They don't have a choice. Their employees need to access different things from different times. So they're going to be using their personal cell phones, their personal laptops, everything like that. So first of all, you need to ensure your security measures are in place. A lot of what we've talked about, use of VPNs, multi-factor authentication, zero trust architecture setups, and obviously logging. So this specific example, logging was missing, and that's a huge issue that we see quite a bit. But without those sound policies in place, there's also other things that come up. So for this example, we recently sent a team on site, and they identified patient 0 as an employee who opened a phishing email on their personal cell phone. This led to a full network compromise. That's another issue with the highlight of needing network segmentation. But this was a massive issue since we had no access to the personal device to conduct forensics. So bottom line, if you're allowing it as an organization, there needs to be something in writing for times like these, so the employees understand that their personal device might need to be accessed during an investigation. And if you don't have anything like that in place, that creates heartburn for the organization, for the people conducting incident response, and for the person whose cell phone it was, because they're put in a really uncomfortable situation. So if you need to use it, you need to have those policies in place and in writing so everyone's aware.
So I think that's actually, I have not heard it as prescriptive as what you just said, which is because often what you hear is, you should be issuing devices for your employees. That's the best way to do this, and encourage them not to use personal devices. But going to that earlier point about workarounds, people are going to use their personal devices. And so what I'm hearing you say, and I think it's to Phil's earlier point about policies, is if you can have employees sign something, have a policy, have an agreement that says if you're using your personal device for work, and you're identified to have a source, that you will then offer up your device for investigation, for forensic analysis. Obviously, there are a whole bunch of issues that fall into that, but I think it is an interesting way to approach it, because it puts then the responsibility on the individual, and then they may just choose to say, just give me a device, or I don't want to have to deal with that. But I think looking at that piece, it's trying to come up with these policies that get at those issues in a way that allow for greater security. Phil, what are you seeing, and what are your thoughts on how to address those challenges?
So, I mean, I think the uniform cybersecurity advice is always going to be, don't allow BYOD, right? Because it's a uniform bad. I mean, nothing good can happen. It's not like somebody's personal device is going to have better security than what you're issued on a corporate environment. But I think companies just have to look at it from a business perspective. As James said, there's some places where it's not really choice. It's gonna, there may even, the base corporate device may be a personal device. I think people need to look at, if you're going to ban BYOD, and like a lot of government organizations do, right, then you have to really mean it, and you have to enforce it. Because the very worst thing you can do is ban it, be blind to it, and then know it's really happening. Because now you've got something that you can't threat manage for. It would be great to have a policy that you can look at data on a personal device, but you have to look to see whether that's possible, right? I'm pretty sure in Europe, in large parts of Europe, that's not an enforceable policy, and so that might be a reason they would say no. And who knows with all the things that California is doing. All of which I support, by the way, because I love privacy. I just would say, if you're not the federal government, you need to look about degree of enforceability. If you can't do that, if you're not willing to eat the costs, both in terms of IT expenses and business consequences, for example, you could conceivably not hire or lose people that are younger than I am, who want to be on a device all the time, right? Who might be working from their personal device, but they're not going to have two laptops in front of them at 8 o'clock at night when they're watching a video and doing something. And that you just need to be conscious about what that is, and then think about what your policies and practices ought to be depending on what you decide. So, for example, let's say you do allow BYOD. Look at your acceptable use policies. Maybe your acceptable use policies say you can't surf the internet from a business device. You got to do that from your personal device. Well, now, think about all the consequences, right? Now a person who wants to work at home at night is going to do it from a BYOD personal device because they want to surf the internet at the same time. And you may actually be in a better position if they get owned on a corporate device where you've got all the tooling you need than if they've get owned on a personal device that has access to all the same corporate resources. So it's a very complicated question. I think a large part of corporate America, maybe outside financial institutions, have simply said, we're giving up the ghost on this. We don't think we can get away with banning BYOD. And in that case, it's better to manage the transition and see what you can do rather than pretend you can banish it.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point from human behavior, and it goes to these policies, right? I mean, set out guidelines, guardrails, and see how far you can get with them, because I do think this piece becomes so important, and it is a challenge. And it's sort of like mobile security. A couple years ago, I asked Grant Schneider, who was the CIO and OMB and was straddling with the National Security Council. we were playing, just going back and forth, like, what do you think of when you think of this? What do you think of when you think of that? And I said, what do you think of when you think of mobile security? And he said, I'm afraid of it. Because the idea was just that, how do we secure these devices? How do we tell individuals to secure them, and what to do? And I think, as to James's point, this foundation as as policies and guardrails is certainly a starting point. I could go on a lot longer with questions, and I may be able to, but I said I would open it up to Q&A in these last 15 minutes. And so I did see that we've gotten a couple questions. And so this, to both James and to Phil, one of the questions is it worthwhile to work through a VPN, or is that just a marketing ploy?
I'd like to hear what CISA has to say about that.
We don't endorse any sort of product. I think it's excellent if you use them. Definitely not a marketing ploy. I don't believe that. But there is other ways you can go about having a secure network without using a VPN. Much like a zero trust architecture, it doesn't necessarily rely on a VPN device, but it's going to get you there based on network segmentation and other policies that you can implement into your network. So interesting question. I definitely don't believe it's just a marketing ploy, but I'm not going to hammer home that you absolutely need them either.
Phil, what about you?
So it's a complicated answer. There are certainly people in the information security community who would say a VPN is just a marketing ploy. I am not one of them, and I have a VPN that I use when I'm on like Amtrak or using any other public Wi-Fi hotspot, because it gives me a degree of assurance. Now, am I just as secure if I'm using, end-to-end, strongly authenticated HTTPS connections? Probably, but I like the security feeling, even if it's just a panacea or a placebo. Just a placebo that I've got, that all of that traffic is going back and forth over a secure link. But what you can't do with a VPN is think it's a panacea, right? VPN software is itself another route that can be compromised, you always need to think about what is the way I'm actually going to securely connect to the place that I want to go. I don't use a VPN at home, and if I'm VPNing from an insecure device, that doesn't really help me. Or if I'm VPNing, and depending on the way the VPN is set up, whether I'm sharing my internet connection, right, with people in my household, because there's a whole bunch of risks to manage here, and there are, as James said, other things, network segmentation, software-defined networks. There are other approaches that one can look at as well. So I just say it can be valuable. It can be a lower cost way to get things done, but please don't, if you're running a corporate network, think that the device on the end of a VPN is secure. And if you think of a VPN as extending your corporate environment so that a device in my house is the same as one on your network, then I've got a bridge in Brooklyn, right? The long-term strategy of perimeterizing networks as opposed to deperimeterizing them, maybe using zero trust networking, is an absolute loser. All that said, I have a VPN.
Well, and I think, Phil, to both what you and James have said, and I think this is just a theme also through our discussion, is that these are all tools, and you have to figure out the tools that are going to make the most sense, but also recognizing that nothing is the holy grail. Nothing is absolute. That's part of the dynamic that we live in. And we talk a lot about risk management, resilience. And so it's figuring out where those are for that piece. And I think, all of those points align, obviously, in thinking about this. We have another question from Kathy Dannenberg. She said, not sure if this fits the meeting, but we are a college, and I'm interested whether AI behavior endpoint protection for servers and workstations will eventually replace signature-based AV protection.
So I'll take a crack. not totally replace. Well, AV detection almost certainly. Signature-based malware prevention has a rapidly decreasing return on investment. So much so that, standard signature-based AV, it'll catch, if there's a guy walking up to your door with a sledgehammer and is pounding on it in broad daylight, signature-based AV may catch that and not a whole lot else, right? So AI or cloud-based work, I think, is going to be increasingly important and is already, I think, an industry standard. I wouldn't go farther, though, and say block lists are going to go away entirely. I think there are some known bad things like domains and IP addresses where block lists still have value, and you still need rapid detection and things like artificial intelligence to be able to pick up new badness. But I don't see block listing and allow listing going away in the short to mediate term.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, James, do you have any other comments on that? I think this is it's an interesting question about what comes next.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I can answer it from a CISA perspective. That behavior-based is the goal. It's the way to go. It's also very difficult to implement that when you're dealing with a ton of data. So with CISA, the way we're postured is kind of an oversight agency over all federal government agencies. We have a program called Einstein, where we have sensors deployed in front of all these agencies, and we're bringing in an unbelievable amount of data. So all the traffic in and out of these agencies every day. And so to rely on a behavior-based system would be near impossible. You'd have to go back and try to baseline all this data. There's a lot of things that would have to be done, a lot of money spent, and it would take a long time to get it to the point where you're really comfortable with it. So we're still relying on signature-based. We deploy snort signatures into these IDS sensors. So it's a goal, and behavior-based is obviously the way to go if you can do it. But there's a lot of different nuances, different ways that organizations leverage detecting malicious activity. So it'll be a huge transition, and it'll probably take some time.
Thank you, James. Well, I think there's so many questions. You mentioned zero trust. There are all these issues around it. What I hope this discussion has offered to the attendees are not just the identification of the challenges, but some very concrete prescriptive approaches and solutions for how to address it. Vivek has put everyone's website, the three organizations' website, into the Q&A. So please see that. I'll actually give everybody a chance to say that again. We all have free resources. I encourage everyone to do that. James, can you just repeat your website again?
So it's CISA.gov, so CISA.gov. And then if specifically for telework, it's just /telework. We'll get you to that landing page. Thank you.
And Phil?
The website for the organization is Global Cyber Alliance, all written out.org. And all of our toolkits, including the Small Business Toolkit, are at gcatoolkit.org.
Thank you. And CRI is Cyber Readiness Institute.org, and we've got the free tools on there as well. It's been such a pleasure talking with both of you. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope it's been helpful to all the participants. I think this is a dynamic environment where we're all going to continue to contribute in whatever ways we can to help. But certainly this is not the end of the story. We've got an interesting year ahead of us as we're figuring out this hybrid workplace, but appreciate the work that each of your organizations are doing, because both obviously are doing tremendous work in the space, and it's always a pleasure and an honor to collaborate with each of you. So thanks so much, and thanks to the participants today. Appreciate it. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.